I'd like to welcome you to the second experiment that we've had, I think, in the last 2 years of having a panel discussion to permit the audience to clarify their unanswered questions in their minds of the people who they heard from during the day. And so today we have, basically we don't need to introduce everybody because you know who they all are. We have the panel who will deal with the evening in the following way. As I said, this panel is for you. And at the beginning, I'm going to ask the panelists to take 2 minutes each and mention only the things that they most strongly feel about, or the most logical conclusion. We'll use a little timer that we've become comfortable with for 2 minutes, so that'll make it easy for you. Except for James Carrion, who has not been able to share his thoughts with us today, who will have 5 minutes, or maybe 7, depending. And then, as far as the questioners in the audience are concerned, we will have a traveling mic for you to use. And I think that's it right there. We'll give you the mic and use it based on your hand raising if possible. Either direct the question to one speaker or make it to the panel in general. That's your choice. We're asking you to ask a question, not give a speech, although we recognize that sometimes it's necessary to have a little preamble in order to make the question clear. And I'd like to encourage you to avoid multiple questions because it taxes our minds to try to remember what order they're in. And on the other hand, we don't want you to leave this room feeling unsatisfied that you had the question you were burning to ask and you never got any satisfactory answer. So that's instructions for the audience. And for the panelists, I would encourage you, even though we have a traveling mic, if you feel it's comfortable, restate the question, repeat it, or maximize the clarity, and this gives you a chance to think about your answer anyway. And typically, I've read a survey that said the most effective answers for TV personalities are done in 45 seconds. So I think we should avoid, 2 or 3 minute answers and avoid 2-second answers. So those are my suggestions. And other than that, I'm just going to be one of the panelists doing their thing. And actually, I'd like to suggest that we start at the other end with Claude. Is that okay, Claude? Just 2 minutes to summarize whatever you'd like to say.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I don't have anything that is burning on my mind. It's a very exciting time to be alive. A lot of things happening on the planet today, and I think a lot of the ferment that we're seeing in science reflects that. There's an opportunity here for enormous growth and enormous learning and enormous spiritual growth. I think that's as part of the whole process, along with the scientific discoveries. So that's really all I have to say.
I guess I'd start with the highlights of the talk. First of all, I think the physical reality of UFOs is proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Every sensor we have picks them up. What they are, hard to say. I think the biggest problem in the field today stems from the Condon report, which made it not okay to study. If you are in a profession and choose to, particularly scientific community, and choose to study UFOs, you're at risk. And that is because of the perception in the community. There's also been studies done, by the way, of looking at what scientists think about the various fields in phenomenology, UFOs in particular, what the public feels about it, and they're living in 2 different worlds. I'll also address one issue that's kind of clear, and I'm sure Mr. Hellyer is going to, we have agreed to disagree. But Corso came up as a key issue. We knew of Corso long before, day after Roswell. I was with him 1 week, spent a day with him 1 week before he died. At that time, he showed me the manuscript that he was writing on that says, he had to correct all of the mistakes that came out of day after Roswell. The other thing that I did do is spend considerable amount of time checking not only his career, but all of the technologies involved. and I can tell you that they simply do not track. What you find is a starting point for all of the technologies were mentioned. It's a continuous growth. There are no step functions. And I've talked to many of the key people involved in the R&D. It's simply not there. Certainly not lasers, night vision, any of those sorts of things.
See, James, why don't we do you last, if that's okay? Unless you do it right now. We could do it, James, right now. James is the International Director of MUFON, or Mutual UFO Network, and he's going to speak to us for the first time.
I was told that I had 5 minutes to discuss the UFO phenomena with a group of open-minded scientists, and the first thing that came to mind was, aren't all scientists open-minded? Mainstream science seems to be confounded by this subject, and it may come as a surprise to you, but those of us who study it seriously are just as perplexed. But at least we're willing to acknowledge this pink elephant that's in the room. We have this 60-year-old mystery, probably much older, and the question that comes to mind, at least for me, is there a solution to this mystery, and why haven't we found it yet? Or is the nature of the phenomena so intricate, so complex, that it possibly involves the very nature of consciousness itself? That's the problem with ufology. We always seem to have more questions than we do answers. But consider this. We're trying to define a phenomena that is difficult just to define, just based on the spectrum of activity, which is so broad. Who can say where the phenomena begins and where it ends? When we have credible witnesses, some who report seeing nuts and bolts craft in the sky, and then followed by that, the initiation of poltergeist activity in their home. Or those folks that receive telepathic messages from entities of unknown origin. Or those folks that see a classic flying saucer and a Bigfoot creature at the same time. The overlapping boundaries of psychic phenomena, cryptozoology, spirituality, makes it difficult for us to compartmentalize the data for study. And it often feels like an exercise in ambiguity. MUFON is going to be celebrating its 40th anniversary next year. The organization was founded in 1969, soon after the Carrion Committee released their results, and soon after the Air Force terminated Project Blue Book. We have a t-shirt for sale on our website at www.mufon.com, and the t-shirt on the front has the MUFON logo, and on the back the words, "Doing the Air Force's job since 1969." So what is MUFON doing today? Well, we're actively investigating UFO reports. That's what we've pretty much done for the last 40 years. But we've also formed two research teams. One is our history team and one is our abduction team. Our history team is looking at the early history of the phenomena and specifically looking in government archives for factual information. Our abduction team is taking a closer look at the abduction experiencer phenomena. And they're using two databases that MUFON has organized throughout the years. One is our abduction monitoring project, and the other one is our abduction transcription project. Our annual symposium is coming up in July in San Jose, and the theme of the symposium is UFOs, a Worldwide Phenomena. We have a great lineup of speakers from a number of different countries, from Chile, from Peru, from the UK, from Canada, from Mexico, from Belgium. We hope you can join us there. When it comes to ufology, I'm sort of the new kid on the block as compared to such luminaries as Jerome Clark and Dr. Bob Wood and John Schuessler, who have lived UFO history. I'm not a scientist, but I do have a passion for the truth. And I'm sure that you're here today because you share that same passion. Your studies and your research into diverse phenomena is relevant and extremely important for us to understand the UFO phenomena. And I applaud your efforts. I'm honored to be your guest. Thank you.
Thank you.
What an exciting time to be alive and to realize what we've always suspected, and that is that we're not alone in the cosmos, and that there are other people there, probably some real people and some in different forms that we don't understand and wish we did understand. And there are various kinds of them, and they come from various parts of the cosmos. And they are more advanced than we are in most cases that we know of anyway. And they are not only advanced technologically, but in many cases they're more spiritual than we are, and some of them think that we have lost our connection with the source. And like my new friend that I've just met, I too am seeking the truth. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get the truth in absolute terms, because we're talking about one of the most interesting, but at the same time most complex questions ever to come into our human sphere. And I guess I wish I had more years to work at it, but I'm going to take full advantage of the ones I've got left. Thanks.
I got interested in UFOs when I was 11 years old, which was in 1957. So, as James just said, I have lived UFO history, as Bob has, and we've been around for a long time and seen all kinds of things come and go, and many disappointments, more disappointments than breakthroughs. And I am certain, unfortunately, and I'm not a pessimist by nature, that the UFO phenomenon will continue to be marginalized. Science will continue to neglect it. It is a question that science will have to take up one day, because UFOs won't go away. The SETI project will continue to fail, and old, conservative, stubborn scientists will die. And one day, when the scientists who claim on the basis of no evidence that the galaxy is densely populated are finally called one too many times on the absence of evidence for this extraordinary proposition, some upstart young astronomer is going to say, well, you know, we could look at those UFO reports. That's what's going to happen. In the meantime, I think that one thing that has retarded progress, obviously besides the fact that we don't have access to scientific expertise and funding and all those things, is that we're making a series of category errors. And I think that with the UFO phenomenon, as with other kinds of extraordinary claims, as I said in my lecture this morning, there's more than one thing going on. There's an anomalous event phenomenon, and there's an experience anomaly phenomenon, and they're only superficially related, and attempts to sweep them under one explanatory scheme will get us nowhere, which is in many ways where we are now. We just have to rethink what we're dealing with. The event phenomenon is something that is eminently scientific and scientifically investigatable. If science had its resources directed toward that problem, it probably would have solved it by now. The experience anomaly phenomenon is much more intractable and far beyond current knowledge. And now I turn it over to my friend Bob.
Thank you. I'll start the timer. Even though I began to be interested in the mid-'60s, and my first book I ever read was by Don Menzel. And as I read it, wow, this guy seems like he's forgetting some stuff. Anyway, right now my focus is on question documents. And my conclusions I mentioned this morning is that some of these documents are authentic. And if they're authentic, what that means is there have been and maybe still be some covert programs of the United States and maybe other countries too. And the reason that's the case is because the dominant reason for keeping it secret from the very beginning was to capture the technology. If the first crash happened in 1941 or so, we were basically about to start the World War. So critical to protect the technology and figure out how they work and how to use them as weapons. I don't know whether we've learned a lot of secrets or relatively few secrets, but I do know that my judgment is that there have been and are classified programs, and that some of my documents are authentic. Forgot to set the timer, so I'll assume that was 2 minutes. And I think now we're ready for some questions from the audience. And,
Can I respond to one thing first?
pardon me?
I'd like to respond to one thing that actually James said, that I
Okay.
think is a huge misperception that all the audience applying. And that was your T-shirt. It says, doing the Air Force's job. And one of my bullets on the slide on the Condon report is Condon was right. The question to Condon was not, are there UFOs? It was, is this a threat? This is the Department of National Defense, not the Department of, let's check things in aviation. We have an aviation department, and as we mentioned, there have been interactions, certainly, with aircraft that are of nature. But the Air Force certainly would not assume that this is necessarily inherently their mission. They would, if attacked, probably see the mission to defend us. They haven't seen a threat.
Thank you.
That we need to change our T-shirt to say overtly doing the Air Force's job since 1969.
I'm going to take the closest raised hand right here.
Well, it seems to me that one of the things that could be most easily checked, because it's a matter of history and people involved are still alive and such, is this one of the origin of technology. I hear one claim that the origin of technology has followed a smooth progress with the originators of it, still telling their stories, and it's quite clear that where things come from, the pedigree of the laser, fiber optics, and so on. And then I hear also the acceptance of the Corso story, that all this is due to back engineering and so on. And it seems to me that this is eminently checkable. In fact, we have someone right here in the very first row, Russell Targ, who could talk about the origin of the laser, I'm sure. And it looks to me as if this is a problem that could be addressed and pretty unambiguously answered as to whether or not it's the one track or the other that is the origin of the technology that's the basis of the world today.
Okay, who'd like to answer that?
If that's for me, been done.
Oh,
That
okay.
they went and, if Russ may want to take on lasers. Let me take on one of the ones specifically that's in there, talk about alien eyeballs and night vision. If you look at the development of night vision optics, straight line. Since we want to name names, Lou Cameron, who was the director of Night Vision Lab, personal friend, surprisingly would be interested in the topic and very open. But we know exactly how photomultipliers came along, how the night vision process came along, how the transitions went from initially infrared to photomultipliers to now thermal imagery. There are no step functions, and the rest of them, integrated circuitry. I'll let Russ address lasers.
I was going to have a word to say about lasers. They came out of Columbia University, Charles Towns, and Archival had an idea to make a maser, which is a microwave amplifier by stimulated emission of radiation. And the maser was a microwave device. And at Columbia, they were looking for ways to make it higher and higher frequency, move from long wavelengths to millimeter waves. And then in the middle 50s, Gordon Gould, who was a student of Charles Towns, said, why don't we try and make an optical maser, move from millimeter microwaves to 10-micron optical waves and shorter optical waves. And it all began with Meggers, who observed laser action at the Bureau of Standards in 1930. So you have a very clear path going from spectroscopic measurement in the 30s to lasers in May 16th, 1960, when Ted Maiman built a first optical maser, which we call a laser. But I had a question of my own now that I wanted to ask. See, I have no credentials to ask anything about UFOs. I'm a paranormalist, though, so I've been talking about remote viewing for many years. And I get a lot of airtime. People are always asking me about remote viewing on the radio and television. And along the way, they ask me about UFOs. And I'm tired of saying, I'm ignorant, I don't know anything. And out of this conference, I found a general consensus, believe it or not, and the experts seem to all agree that something like UFOs exist, and the government is probably lying about it. But I'm looking at expertise more than 100 years in duration from this panel. And when people ask me, how does ESP work, I hate that question, but I have something to say. I can write an equation on a blackboard, I can draw a diagram, and say, I don't know that this is the answer, but the answer looks something like this. I would be interested if any or some of the distinguished panel here could give me their best guess as to where UFOs come from and what they are.
James, you want to go for that?
Of course they come from the Pleiades, we all know that. No, I don't have a good answer for that.
But you have a guess.
I have a guess. No, actually, I don't even have a guess. But I do want to address what you talked about, the government interest in the subject. A lot of folks think this is conspiracy theory. This is not conspiracy theory, folks. This is real. There's an active and real interest on the part of certain elements within our power structure in this field. The question is why? Are we talking about the protection of some secret that is of an extraterrestrial nature, of an interdimensional nature? I don't know. All I know is that in my job as the director of MUFON, I see enough overt interest to know that there is some secret here. And I don't know what that secret is, but I sure would like to find out.
Okay,
And,
I'd like to go
so I don't
on
want to address that.
to some other questions from other people. Yes.
Some other answers, more than some other.
Sure.
Well, okay.
Because I obviously clearly disagree. I think the difference is what I pointed to today, the difference between individuals who are interested, and I have talked to people at all levels, all ranks, and it runs the full gamut. As you might expect, but 7% of the adult population have seen UFOs. That holds true within the military as well. There are many people who are quite interested. That does not translate to institutional interest. They're up to their ass in alligators right now. And this is not something that's going to, rise to, in the near future. It's not going to rise to any level of significance.
Well, if I were to contribute to your answer to where do they come from and what are they, is that, in my opinion, it's straightforward. They come from multiple different societies that are separated hundreds of light years in many cases away, have figured out a way to travel faster than the speed of light or to get here through some wormhole or something like that. And we just don't have the technology. That's where the secret in my mind that's important to discover is how do they work, because we can, I think, improve our societal life on this planet by using those technologies in a way that's appropriate.
Bob, can I follow up, though? I don't think where they come from is the right question. Whatever we're looking at is terribly complex, and I strongly suspect that there's a consciousness component in this.
Oh, I agree with that completely.
If you look at the reports over time, what you find are that the UFOs are not super far in the distance, but a little bit beyond, where we are today. If you look at the one, I think we heard Jerry talk about some this morning, the 1800s, we're talking about airships. We weren't talking about things zipping around. Jacques Vallée has a classic one from the early 1900s where a guy drives around a corner, sees a shiny UFO there, and every rivet is standing out. Well, we now know that rivets, are not a technology you would use in, far distant future. So within 50 years that was done. But because of what you did mention about the interrelationship of a number of phenomena, I strongly suspect a consciousness component, and I can't tell you what that is or where that comes from.
Right. Okay, let's have some other questions.
Many discussions about the UFO phenomenon are premised on the assumption that the occupants of these craft are somehow more advanced than we are apart from technology. And I'm curious to know, what's your read on the evidence for making assumptions about how advanced they are or how much more spiritual they are or anything like that.
Anybody want to try that one?
Yeah, I don't really see. I know some will vehemently disagree, and I don't pretend to infallibility here, but I have never seen any evidence myself as a historian of the phenomenon that UFO intelligences are spiritually superior to us. I think there are certain kinds of presumptions you can reasonably make. For example, let us assume they're from some extrasolar civilizations. Just the fact that they got here, that they had a technology that got them here, means that they have at least some things in common with us. They have curiosity, they have science, they have a desire to learn things, to go places. So they do have things in common with us. An alien intelligence that got here in machines, just by the nature of the fact that it flew here in machines, would mean that we did have some things in common with it. But the spiritual aspect I see is coming out of kind of quasi-religious experiences that people have that are vivid and compelling to them, but not demonstrably related to the UFO phenomenon, whatever the appearance of the communicating entities might suggest. I think that these are in the category what I called in my lecture this morning experience anomalies. The UFO phenomenon, the core UFO phenomenon, the daylight disk phenomenon, the phenomenon that leaves ground traces is the event phenomenon. That's the anomalous event which is scientifically investigatable, and all we really know about them is that apparently they're from extrasolar civilizations. That's a reasonable inference. They have a technology, and they're curious enough to be here. We don't know much beyond that, but I don't really see myself any evidence that we have any cause to worship them or to turn to them for superior religious insights.
Anyone else on the panel want to add to that? Okay, we've got a question here.
Yes, this is addressed to Paul and the others as well. But Paul, you mentioned earlier today that in your presentation that that Werner von Braun had mentioned or had hinted that the Germans may have gotten some technology from some advanced source, we'll say, and that was maybe explained why they were so much far ahead of us prior to World War II in their development of jets, rockets, and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, and also for the rest of the panel to address the claim by some that the Germans themselves had developed some type of a flying disc or a disc-shaped flying device.
Yes, I have no knowledge on what they had actually achieved. I have read in two different places recently about von Braun's hints and his reluctance to talk about it very much for reasons of having taken some kind of an oath, very much like the reason many of our military people are not anxious to talk about these things today. And I suspect there's some validity in it from the sources that I read. I wish I could remember specifically which ones they were, and I would tell you. Paula Harris is here tonight, and I think she knows a lady, Carol Roslin, who worked with von Braun and was talking about the military-industrial complex back in the time when General Eisenhower was worried about it. And he apparently said about the industrial military complex that first it will be the communists, and then it will be the terrorists, and then it will be the extraterrestrials, and that this would be the justification for maintaining very large defense expenditures and a very large industrial complex related to it. And Carol's still around, so you could contact her and check it out with her if you're interested.
Anyone else care to comment on the German work of the late 30s?
Yeah, I'd like to give you a more pragmatic approach and a caution. And I think the pragmatic approach was the German educational system that emphasized science, rewarded scientists, and that they made great advances in that. My admonition is looking at American science and where we are today and what's happening in our educational system. I think if there's a real weak point, that's it.
Okay, another question over here.
Thank you. One of the astonishing things that I think has happened recently is several governments are beginning to open up and to release information. One is, of course, the French Cometa report, which puts Paul Hellyer in pretty good company with some higher-ups in the space program there in France, as well as the defense industry, who show, even though this report was supposed to be secret, it was leaked out, and they seem to have real concern about what's going on, real concern that there is some danger, if only the danger of colliding with, other aircraft. Since that time, the Brits are starting to release information, Mexico, Brazil, and I think others. Any comment about this phenomena that seems to be happening?
Is it directed to any particular one?
Let me start with John Alexander, and then anybody else that would like to.
Not sure, but I might tell you a war story. I'll come to a war story in a minute, something that happened last week. First of all, when you look at the reports, the British reports of things that's coming out, nothing startling there. I was in a position to see most of the classified material and all that at a time when I could see the classified and the unclassified. I would tell you 98% of the information was already available in the public domain. About the 2% that was left had, how does this censor system work that made the collection and things of that nature. My war story is I was in Paris at a major arms conference last week and cut it down a bit. The Brazilian ambassador to France walked up, and the Vice Admiral was there, and he introduces me, and I thought we were talking about weapons, because it was a weapons conference, and he says, here's a guy who knows about UFOs, to which the ambassador said, let me tell you about the 3 times I saw them. So that's always a risky proposition, but he came out and just said, bang, 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 here's what it is. There are societies, Chile, you mentioned France. There's quite a bit of information coming out. As you know, my take is different from the panel. I don't think we have a lot of information that's going to startle anybody.
There was one here.
May I say something, Bob?
Oh, excuse me.
John, don't include me in that. I pretty much share your view. I think of what William Goldman, the Hollywood screenwriter, wrote about the film industry. He said one thing that he learned in Hollywood was that nobody knows anything. And I think that I've been listening to your comments, and I'm entirely in accord with your point of view.
I want to step out of my moderator role for a second and pretend I'm behind there answering a question. And I want to go back and answer Bernie's question with a specific report. And that is, last time I was at the National Archives, I was looking specifically for documents that might relate to the initiation of technology after the Cape Girardeau crash in 1941. And so I came across some some classified reports from Purdue University, where they had a contract, which at the time was not public, to look at germanium silicon diodes. And the distribution list included Ed Condon, and it was from Lincoln Laboratory, and their parts they sent to Bell Laboratories. And this was 1942. They wrote 15 reports on this subject at increasing levels of sophistication, showing the dielectric properties of germanium silicon mixtures of various percentages, as well as the potential to go beyond simple rectification. Their contract was for rectifiers. So I share with you only because it's the beginning of a seed in my mind for a genuine investigation of whether that was a credible trail that would have led to the transistor. So that's just it's not a proof or anything. It's just something that I might 5 years from now be able to come and tell you, hey, I proved this. Okay, that's...
I think, Bob, if you just give me a minute, I would like to now dissent from 2 of my colleagues in this sense, that I do not believe that there are people who don't know anything. I think there are some people who know a very great deal and are being very secretive about it and keeping it very close to the chest. And I think that they are the people who are repositories of tremendous amount of knowledge, who could answer most of the questions we're talking about tonight with very definitive answers. And my hope and prayer is that it won't be too long before they will share that information with us, or as much as is possible, and that we will stop floundering around like fish on a dock somewhere.
Thank you for that view. We have a question here from...
I'd like to ask for some comments on these recent reports from, I think it was in Texas, mainly Stephenville. I had some impression that it was getting almost the tipping point of getting to be broader publicity and the media picking up on it and really discussing it, but I'd like to hear some comments on that.
Thank you. James?
Stephenville is interesting because once Stephenville hit the media, then everybody down in that area was seeing UFOs. And that's what you would expect from a media frenzy and people looking up at the skies. Our investigators were down there and took a number of reports. We looked at a number of videos and photos, and really nothing dramatic. But we did actually manage to get, through Freedom of Information, the FAA radar data, because the surrounding military installations surprisingly said they had none, but yet the FAA did. And we're finding some very interesting things about that FAA radar data, specifically where those F-16s were that the Air Force blamed the sighting on, and also some anomalies all in addition to that. In fact, we're going to be releasing a report on that shortly. That's going to be in the MUFON journal. And I think you'll find the radar data to be very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Here we have another question.
Yes, my name is Li Ping. I served as chair of Chinese UFO research organization for 4 years, which is the only UFO research organization in China which is still now active. I have one question for James. How many percentage of the so-called UFO abduction cases, how many of the abductees are Asian?
I'm sorry, how many of the abductions were?
Asian.
Oh, Asian. To be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know if we have those demographics.
To my understanding, it's almost none. We didn't find any in China, believable cases. What this is tell us? Aliens are selective? That's my question. Thank you.
That's
Okay,
very
so-
interesting. Thank you.
Did you want me to comment?
Did anybody want to comment on that besides James? No, okay. Did you have one?
I work with a guy who was on Dr. Wolf's AlphaCom team, and he claims that, according to documents he read when he was working with Michael Wolf, that there were at least 200 crashes worldwide. Now, if their technology is so advanced, why are there so many crashes? Any comments?
Well, I could comment on that. There's, I think, strong evidence that we were aggressively trying to shoot them down for the purpose of recovering the craft and figuring out how they work. Not only us, but the Soviets. That doesn't account necessarily for all of them, though. That would be my partial answer. Anybody else want to add? Okay.
As you know, in the history of science and technology, every now and again there are events that define a tipping point. They define the point when a phenomenon is undeniable. So when Columbus attempted to sail around the Earth and he made the progress that he made, eventually that was a turning point in our awareness. Or when the Wright brothers got off with that 18 seconds, there was again a moment in time where we knew that something different had happened. And now I hear a comment about how somebody claiming that there's been over 200 crashes of sites, I mean, of craft, supposedly crashes or having been shot down or whatever. And yet, what the skeptic always argues, and I'm talking about the Michael Shermers and so on, of the professional skeptic organization who get paid for being skeptics, is that there really is no single event, no single piece of data, like a Columbus, and they don't use that phrase, but like a Columbus or like a Wright brothers, that has happened. And I, by the way, I consider myself a fairly forward-looking scientist. And yet in the area of, quote, UFOs, I'm still confused because I don't see that kind of evidence. And yet all of you, I presume, at this point, when you look at the totality of the evidence, I'm getting to my question, but I need to frame it properly because I really want to push you for an answer. Because it's not every day I get to a meeting where you've got such a group of distinguished people who have really thought about this for a long period of time, who actually have information that could inform someone like myself. And before I ask my question, I should say that I come from a state which has supposedly one of the largest mass sightings over hours of an anomalous aerial phenomena that was witnessed by various people, at least within the state of Arizona, starting from the Grand Canyon area, traveling down I-19 into Phoenix, then all the way down to Tucson, then back up to Phoenix. So it was witnessed by maybe tens of thousands of people over a long period of time.
And you're moving towards a question?
Yes. And yet, and I've seen videotapes, and I know the people involved, and so on. And yet, I myself still question how to interpret such phenomena. So my question is, if you were to pick the one best, firmest piece of, and I will call it physical evidence, either it being an indentation in property or some verified piece of foreign craft or something that would say, well, yes, there have been 200 reports of crashes, but we don't have a single piece of, verifiable or photographed or some credible piece of evidence. And I'm asking this question of John first, because I'd like you to say to me in public, gee, Gary, of all the stuff that I've heard, the single most Wright brothers-like phenomena is X.
Well, I'm glad you gave that example, the Wright brothers. If you go to Brazil, they will take great deference to what you said because they believe their pilot was up before the Wright brothers. So it's an interesting example of perception. I think the perception of the skeptics by most of us is they're not skeptics at all. They're debunkers. And when faced by any amount of information, will just reject it a priori.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing that happens in dealing with the skeptical community, they will come up with, well, maybe it was pick your thing, that fills in a small part of the observation, disregards the rest of the data, and then says, and therefore, we've disproved it. And now in your field, you've run into this, I'm sure, with great detail.
That doesn't address my question. I want to know what piece of evidence.
Well, let me comment on that particular point. The nature of your question moves in a direction away from the data. The data we have is the only available data. And if you look at those data, you find mountains of detailed observations that are radar visual cases that have been studied for decades, which overwhelming evidence. Now, if you say, can I see the parts that we've recovered from crashed saucers? The answer is no, because they are classified. That's my answer. And therefore, that's the simple reason. It's a very straightforward answer.
Yes, but I heard, for example, someone made a claim about how there was an indentation in the ground that was photographed or whatever, that there have been radioactive observations. I'm just looking for the single best piece of
unclassified.
Can I address that, Bob?
Yes.
Ted Phillips has over 3,000 trace evidence cases that he's investigated throughout the years. We're talking about landing cases, indentations in the soil, radioactivity above the ambient environment, and so on. If you're talking about physical evidence in terms of a piece of a UFO, we don't have any of that. Now, interestingly enough, I just came back from Maine on a case where some guy back in 1976 saw a UFO flying over a lake 4 times, and the third time he saw it, he alleges that he shot at it with a homemade mortar.
That's right.
Yes, that was my initial reaction, too. Well, but when it comes to physical evidence, this is really the holy grail. I mean, if we had a piece of a UFO that we could demonstrate to the world that is of non-terrestrial origin, I think, our case would be solved. So, of course, whenever we get a story like this, we have to follow up on it. So we went up there and we did due diligence, and we didn't come home with any fragments.
Anybody else on this question?
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to see probably the kind of single, isolated, or demonstrative thing like Columbus's landing in this field. But I think when the history of this phenomenon or these phenomena is written, that probably the crash at Roswell will have the dubious honor of being the most important as far as its consequences are concerned. It started the most action. It got the most people involved. It resulted in legislation and research and operations and so on. Now, we had in Canada Wilbert Smith, one of our pioneers, who had actually had some pieces of this stuff, which must have come from the Roswell crash. And he had it analyzed, and it was otherworldly. And he wrote reports about it, which I presume are still there and which we could maybe lay our hands on if we want. But it had characteristics which were unlike metals that anybody on Earth had ever seen. And this is the kind of thing that was going on elsewhere, you can be very, very sure. And I think when he gave the pieces back, I can't remember exactly the quotations, but he was asked where he delivered it. And I think somebody said, did he deliver it to the United States Air Force? And he said, no, higher than that. And then when they pressed the question one more time, he said, well, I can't answer any further than I already have. But he had some of this stuff, and he had contacts, and he found out things from his contacts, such as they gave him the necessary information to build a machine to determine the location of vortices, both those created by the UFOs and created by us, in order to try to avoid so many crashes that were resulting from turbulence and this sort of thing. And he also found out from them one of the reasons that there were so many early crashes was the fact that our pilots were getting too close to the UFOs. The aliens said that they thought that it was really incredible stupidity on the part of the pilots. I would add on the part of their commanders who sent them chasing after UFOs without knowing what they were getting into. But one of the problems they ran into when they got too close to the UFOs was, in some cases, they created what they called as a combination of magnetic time fields, which changed the molecular composition of the metal in the aircraft that were coming up behind them. And so the metal just came apart. And that this was one of the reasons that there were so many crashes for quite a long while that seemed to be unexplained at the time. So there's lots of stuff out there. But the propensity seems to be to downplay it and debunk it rather than trying to get it up into the scientific community.
I think Claude and then Jerome want to comment on that last question too.
I was just thinking back to when I convinced myself that they were real, and I think it was after subscribing to a publication by a man named Lucius Farish in Arkansas called the UFO News Clipping Service. Every month he Xeroxes local newspaper accounts from around the world of local accounts of sightings, and these are usually multiple witnesses, often very responsible, important personages in the towns, all local newspapers. And these are really high-quality sightings. When you read them and you wonder, well, why didn't I ever hear about these? And it's what the only possible answer is that when these things get turned into the wire service never reports them. So there's appears to be kind of a blackout between the local papers and the wire service, so that some of these things would have made, evening news headlines if there were an ability to report them. And I think that that's one of the missing pieces. Maybe we're kind of all waiting for the anchorman to come on the evening news and tell us these things happen, and I don't think it's going to happen. But when I realized that all these sightings do happen locally, it really changed my mind about the whole process.
Thank you. Jerome had a comment.
Yeah, I'd like to put aside the more nebulous and controversial and unproved stories about concealed evidence and contacts with space people and those kinds of things, which, they're interesting, but I don't know that the evidence is very good. The evidence for a physical UFO phenomenon is very good, and the simple answer to your question is go and look up Richard Hall's book, The UFO Evidence. Look up my UFO encyclopedia, which has long, detailed case histories of hard evidence cases like the Transcend Province CE2, the RB-47 case, and a number of cases, radar visuals, physical trace cases, which were well investigated, well documented, that are available in the literature. Dick Hall does a very good job of laying out all the evidence in the UFO evidence, and I will let others judge what kind of job I do in my own books with laying out the evidence. But it's there and it's available. And yours is a good question. The answer is in the good literature.
I think it's a great comment. And John, you had one final point?
Just one. I think Claude just raised an excellent point. And I don't think it's an embargo between the local news and the. There is just a kind of a self-imposed giggle factor. If you look at any of the programs that are out there, you never find them reporting UFOs straight up. It's always ha, ha, ha. Well, look at the little green men. Dateline just did the 10 best cases, and interestingly, in all of the breaks, you see little green men popping up and things like that.
John, can I comment on that point? That's probably true, but was it true in 1954? I think the media handled it differently in 54. Well, in that era.
There was, well, remember, initially it was, what the hell's going on? And that went on for a while. But over time, in large part because of the scientific community who have seen this so negatively and have made major inroads in the press, to get a fair hearing there is really, really tough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we had a question over here, I think, and you finally get your time. And
a quick question for Dr. Alexander. Philip Corso's follow-up book, do you know where that is, and do you know if that'll be published?
He died.
Oh, I know he died, but does not the manuscript?
He died. No, it was, if you know Phil, he was not computer literate. I have a hand copy of the first one. It was literally written out by hand, a few pages typed, but unfortunately he transitioned before we could get any further.
Okay, we have another question.
Well, this
should be on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I wanted to talk to the issue about evidence and conclusions. There are two comments I'd like to make. First of all, I did a study of the meteorite controversy in the 18th century. And here is a very interesting example of how people deal with evidence. A lot of times the evidence may be in somebody's hands, but unless you have the scientific theory, the background basically to interpret it, you won't know what it is. The French Academy of Science was sent 3 meteorites from 3 different sources. They couldn't basically see anything distinctive about them and said basically there's nothing to it except maybe the lightning hits pyrite. That's what they said. Okay, and I can give you more chapter and verse on that. The second thing that I wanted to comment on is in terms of...
Was there a question in that?
Do I have to have a question?
No. Well, go ahead.
I know a little about this too. The second question, or the second observation, which the panel is invited to comment on, is when we think about the sociology, and that's what it is, of what's out there, we really need to use our imaginations. Because the problem is that the tremendous variety of life in the universe lends itself to a huge number of constellations, which may be very difficult for us to interpret because we only have one example of an intelligent species. Okay? But if there are other examples, they could work quite differently than we do. And it's very difficult to use the kind of imagination we need to imagine what they might do and what their actual moves are likely to imply.
Good point. Anybody want to comment? Well, okay.
Well, this has been very illuminating. This is Russ Targ. This is very illuminating for me. But as a scientist, it seems increasingly, from what the panelists have said, is that the UFO question is not at all a scientific question, which surprised me. It seems to be more of a geopolitical question. For example, Paul Hellyer and John Alexander says, yes, there are people in the government who know the answer. They have the pieces. They'll probably kill you if you try and get them. But the answer is known, and we're playing a kind of scientific, I've got a secret, rather than trying to discover what's actually happening. Perhaps we should expend our efforts rather than looking at the sky, trying to get in touch with the people who know the answers and find out what the data actually are.
Well, I would categorically disagree with that. I don't think it's there. Colleague believes it is.
Told us, you said they have the pieces.
No.
But it's still classified.
I did not say that.
He didn't say that. I said it. I said it. He disagrees.
Bob and I agree to disagree on this.
That's right.
Bob,
You have another question?
Bob, can I address that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure. MUFON sponsored a conference last year on this very question. How do we engage mainstream science into looking at this phenomena with all the ambiguity that's inherent? And what we decided is maybe we're engaging the wrong type of scientists. Maybe what we need to look is not at the physical sciences, but start looking at the early evidence for this phenomenon in government, which would have had the most interest in the phenomenon to begin with. So there are vast amounts of documents out there in national archives that have yet to be looked at. So what we need to recruit are a lot more historians that are going to go out there and start digging up these documents for us and looking for patterns in activity. Not necessarily the smoking gun that says we have a captured UFO, but looking at just the patterns of government agencies and what they were doing at those times. So there are things that we can do, and we're working on those.
Okay. Another question.
I really don't really want to speak, but I have to do this because I'm the journalist who brought Colonel Philip Corso to Italy, and he did speak quite a bit over there. He gave us his personal notes, which were the notes on which the day after Roswell were published. He gave us permission to publish the book, Dawn of a New Age. If you go to Italy, I've been speaking to several people, you can buy it in a bookstore. They are his original notes. These notes, his son said, would be published in this country. Corso wrote 3 books, The Day After Dallas, about the Kennedy assassination. He wrote a book called The Man Who Saved Rome about the creation of the CIA because Colonel Corso was the head of intelligence in Rome in 1944. This is not just somebody off the street. And we've checked all his credentials in Italy. We were able to do a lot with him in Italy, and he did leave us that manuscript, which is still around. But for some reason, it is not published in America. It's called L'Alba di una Nuova Era. If you go to Italy, go in a bookstore and get it.
Thank you. Anybody would comment on that? Or I think we've covered Corso quite a bit. Okay.
Several people have mentioned about the necessity of digging into archives and historical documents, and I just wanted to let people know in this audience, if they don't already know, that there is a source called Newspaper Archives, which has approximately 79 million pages of newspapers, of something like 2,700 different newspapers, and you can go back and actually read the original stories in newspapers about the airships or about early sightings. They may not have been called UFOs, but if you look up, use certain terminology like airships or something like that, you can find all kinds of things from way back. And this archive it's online and it's available. You have to pay a little bit, but it's not much, and it goes all the way back to the 1700s.
If I could respond to that. I belong to a small international email group called the Magonia Exchange. It's an international group of Americans, Canadians, and Europeans who are doing extensive archival research, and we've pretty much bled newspaper exchange dry. But there are all kinds of archives, including free ones, that are popping up. In fact, much of the material I use in my lecture today I got off my archival exchanges. In fact, I even wrote a book based upon my archival research into 19th century Forteana and anomalies and proto-UFOs called Unnatural Phenomena. And that book comes out of that. And I'm glad you brought that up because that is an incredibly useful research tool.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
I think that the problem is too much evidence discussion in the collecting data and nothing from the scientific, from the science. I have been working about 30 years in space research. Half of this time I have worked with programs coordinated by the Soviet Union. Half of the time I'm working here in Canada. Never, ever I have seen this problem to be put in front of the scientific community. And it is known that the science now is funded by the government. So if you want to do some kind of research, there is not a way you could apply for some kind of fund. And would you tell me how this issue could be resolved? I think this is a fundamental question for the science to explain how UFO make a right turn with acceleration about 50 to 100 G. So I have a question for the panel about this problem.
Okay, everybody understand the question? No. Well, my interpretation of the question is, what's the process whereby we put scientists on solving some pretty obvious things that are not very clear? It is, how do you do a 100G turn if you have people inside the craft without having some new science added to it, and who's working on that new science?
We don't start with the University of Colorado. I know that.
That's right, yeah. Excuse me, you were next.
Since we're talking about science, given the fact that in the last year, astronomers have discovered all types of extrasolar planets, including, I think, last November, the first Earth-like extrasolar planet. NASA has reopened the SETI program. I don't think they would have just done that, but they did that unless they had some reason for reopening their SETI program after, I think, 20 years. We mentioned already all the countries allowing their secret files to be opened. About 4 weeks ago, the Pope said that aliens are okay with the Catholic religion. It seems to me there's a trend here. If the UFOs aren't announced soon, if there isn't evidence soon, by 2020, we're going to have telescopes that are going to be looking at continents and islands on planets 20 light years away. Are UFOs going to come out before science discovers them?
As a historian of the phenomenon, I might have a little perspective on what you just said. So many things that seem fresh and novel, including speculation that the breakthrough is coming any day, we're being softened up for the big revelation and so on. That basically begins to show up very early in the history of the UFO controversy. By the late 1940s, rumors like that were circulating. So no, I don't think we're being softened up. I don't think anything spectacular is going to happen. It's just going to be more of the same. And on a factual matter, I don't think NASA runs the SETI program. I could be mistaken, but it does now? Okay. Yeah, okay.
Anybody else?
It doesn't fund it. Yeah, I didn't think so.
Okay.
I thought that the SETI program was in private funding.
It's still private funding, I think. Okay. Another question.
As a science teacher of elementary and high school students, as we trace the history of science and the achievements that we can see that we have done down through the years, it's kind of hard for me to say to them, but guess what? The laser was the UFO guys, you know, and the integrated circuit, that wasn't us either. And I don't know how you all can talk to your young children and say to them, guess what? It's not us. It's not our science. And still be able to, like, have that glow of pride as a human being.
I never said that.
Ditto.
I think it requires one of the characteristics that I probably possess in least form, and that's humility. That there may be people elsewhere in the galaxy, in the cosmos, that are more advanced than we are, and perhaps we can learn from them and cooperate with them, and perhaps they're learning some things from us. Apparently, Earth is a good place to visit, or has been in the past anyway, and they come here for their holidays probably to find out what's going on. And I have no doubt that they have learned things from us, and we'll probably learn more, and we have still, I think, quite a lot to learn from them.
Without addressing the ET issue, if you're teaching science, the history of science is really ugly. We tend not to debate that. We talk about all the things as if it were a straight process, when in fact it is a brutal, nasty fight that goes in. It's probably not what you want to tell your little kids going into it, but it is in many fields not uncommon to what you're seeing here.
I would comment on your question that I don't think even those people who might claim that there's some reverse engineering at work in our society today, they would not claim that the people who got the credit for it are not deserving. The most they would have received is a little tiny hint. And the work that they did was totally genuine and properly recognized. So
Can I comment, Bob? Yeah. I just want to say I'm not a proponent of reverse engineering. My personal take on it is that we're belittling human ingenuity. And for the same reason that people try to blame the building of the pyramids on alien intervention, I think we're taking that same line of reason here with modern technology. You know, it's amazing when you walk through Europe and you see some of the cathedrals that were built back then with the technology that they had, and with the average lifespan being 30 years. I think we can do a lot with just our own human mind. We don't have to blame it on the aliens.
Anyone else? New question?
Excuse me, I actually have two questions while I've got the mic. First, have any of the panelists suffered overt official interference with their work? And the second question is, there seems to be a tremendous variety in size and shape of the craft that are seen. Could you comment on that as well?
Two crisp questions.
I guess that probably applies to me, because when I was inside the system, the answer is no. And, you know, there's a great mythology that's now externally, if you saw the papers that I put up today with getting attacked by Scientific American, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, you know, by the skeptics, yeah, that's there. But not only when we ran the group and I was moving up the food chain, not only did we not run into interference, with the exception of one case, and that really wasn't interference, we stepped on his belief system, got a lot of help and a lot of support. There is a lot of high-level interest.
Let's take everybody one at a time. Claude, have you been threatened?
I was just going to comment on the size, the different shapes. I guess it's probably not unexpected when they come from different places, but they range from the very small Foo fighters during World War II, which were very small, too small to accommodate a pilot, through to reports of UFOs a mile across, and everything more or less in between, with the most common kind being the discs of 25, 50, or 150 feet across.
Claude?
I have not received any kind of negative feedback from employers in the past. The only example where I was afraid of one was the first time I was interviewed on Coast to Coast, and my book had just come out, and I worked for an engineering company that did not know about my, extracurricular activity. And of course, one of the people in my group got wind. He was an avid Art Bell fan, so he got wind and told everybody else, hey, make sure you tune in tonight. Claude's going to be on this show. And I was just amazed by how positive and open-minded everyone was. And I've not had any bad experiences since then. As far as the variety of craft, I mean, my impression, I don't claim to know the answer, but my impression is there are lots of different groups that are here from many different places and different functions and different technologies. So that's a possible answer.
And my answer would be, no, I've never been threatened, and yeah, I think it's many places, many places.
There is one case, and it's not somebody here, who I think had tremendous adverse reaction. That's John Mack. And many of you remember that after his book came out. Here he is, a tenured professor at Harvard, Pulitzer Prize winner, you know, all of the criteria you can imagine, and they tried to sanction him. I mean, there was an overt move to try and get a tenured professor out, so it does happen.
Okay, we have another question back here.
Hi, I just wanted to get back to Jacques Vallée's point of view for a second, because it seems to me a point of view that we don't really address very often. When I talked to him at the last IRVA conference in Vegas last year, he told me the reason he doesn't believe that UFOs are structured physical craft is because if you talk to the witnesses, they all report psychic experiences during the weeks before the sightings. So what would it be about this phenomena that it allows people to have sort of telepathic experiences or the phone ringing off the hook without anyone being there before the actual contact happens? I mean, is there anything about his point of view that you kind of can connect with about the phenomena not being entirely a physical, you know, substantive experience?
Well, Jacques in the past, of course, has been a frequent presenter at our meetings. My answer to your question is that we're talking about two-thirds of us are kind of interested in consciousness, and understanding consciousness at the same time understand UFOs would perhaps begin to answer that question.
Well, maybe Claude could
Well, let me address it, because I agree with Bob that there is certainly a consciousness component to this. Having said that, somebody today talked about the imaginal world, and imaginal is very different from imaginary. But the point is that some of them certainly have physical reality, and again, that's because we have multispectral analysis that reports them. So we're looking, I think, at a multiplicity of events and phenomena, and none of them simple.
Okay, Claude, I think I did. Sure. Did you want to comment?
Sure. Hi, Simeon. As was mentioned this afternoon in my talk, this whole similarity between the paranormal, excuse the expression, and the UFO technology, to me, what we're seeing is a whole new range of technologies, a whole new set of phenomena that our current science, as is taught in schools, does not include, that it seems to involve higher dimensions and consciousness and a bunch of other things that have been by and large left out of physics up until now. And I think that when these phenomena come up, we're kind of having it thrust in our face, the fact that these phenomena are real. And if you really want to get high performance and other types of things, you have to start looking at what our science has not looked at yet. I mean, there are some people in the New Age and the healing communities who think that quantum mechanics is the answer, quantum physics is the answer to consciousness. If you really understand quantum physics, it really says very little about consciousness. And I think what we're faced with now is it's time for science to go back and put consciousness into science for real and really merge these two. And I think that some of these new phenomena and abilities may start to come out when we do that.
John?
Yeah, there's a term that I coined that I think George Knapp wrote about. It was cognitive sentient phenomena. And that is that we do have phenomena that seems to morph. It seems to know what we're thinking and where we're going to go. Some of you know we had the ranch in Utah that had phenomenal range of various phenomena. And every time you started to get close, it would change. And it would almost know what you were going to do next, how you were going to respond to it, and say, you like that? Try this. And you would see something different. So it's terribly, terribly complex, and it is cognitive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a disease called experimental science. And what that means is that whenever I hear claims of an observation, it gets immediately converted from an observation into a question into a hypothesis into a possible experimental design, and then I want to go out and do the experiment to see what the outcomes are. And one of the claims that has been observed, which I've personally met people who make the claim, is that there are some people who believe that they can, quote, call in a craft. And I'm sure you're all aware of this. None of you have mentioned this phenomena overtly, at least, or emphasized it. And yet, from an experimental point of view, it's eminently testable, because many different people make these claims, some of whom, on the face of it, seem credible. And I don't mean, for example, like the man in Las Vegas. I'm sure you saw that news reporter a year or two ago who was some religious, obsessed individual. And anyway, the question is, has anyone done formal research to actually see if you take X number of people, 10, 20, 30, who have a history of making claims of videoing phenomena and observing phenomena, where they say, look, I can call them in, and 20% of the time or 80% of the time, a light will appear in the sky. Has anyone ever done that formal experiment to see whether there's even one human being who can do this? That's my question.
I think the short answer is no. It would be a great experiment. That said, there's not very many experiments that go on. One of the problems in the field has been just a dearth of funding. I mean, you go out and try to get qualified research programs in UFO funded, and it is very little money there.
For example, if you hire a forensic document examiner, you're paying them lawyers' fees of $250 an hour or more. It takes money.
Well, I don't think that the idea that somebody can go out and call down spaceships is really at the center of ufologists' concerns. I can offer a couple of anecdotes about going out with people who made those claims and with people who believed them. And when Venus showed up, they made some really extraordinary claims about the spaceship that had been called down. I just think that that is just really non-credible, and really, when there are so many other pressing investigatable questions that really need not concern us very much.
I would like to talk about one experiment that MUFON was involved with. It was our abduction monitoring project. And this was funded to the tune of $200,000, and it was run over a 4-year period. And what we did is we designed basically a little black box of electronics that monitored 15 different parameters in the ambient environment. And we recruited abductees, volunteers who were claiming ongoing experiences, and we placed these devices in their homes. And these devices collected data 24 hours a day over a period of time, which we downloaded to a computer. And at the same time, we asked the abductees to journal about any experiences they had. And the thought was to try to correlate the experience with changes in their environment. Now, that data was collected and sat around for a number of years, and nobody bothered to crunch it. Fortunately, this year, we have a professor from San Jose State University who has the data, and he's crunching the numbers for us, and hopefully we'll have some report by our symposium in July.
Thank you. That's a great example. Anybody else on that? Another question over here.
The question may have been answered, but I'll try it anyway. If we are to start research at this point on UFO, what could be the objectives of such a research? I mean, we're talking about getting more and more data, and it seems from the presentation we heard and from all the literature that we have enough data to convince at least ourselves that it's real. So what's the next? I mean, we blame the government for withholding some data, but how much would it help us to get more data, more radar data, more sightings, and then what? What's the next step?
Panelists, want to comment on that?
That's a MUFON question.
I don't necessarily think it's the quantity of data. J. Allen Hynek was fond of saying we have an embarrassment of riches. We have too much data. It really is the quality of data. When somebody reports a UFO, what actual measurements were made of distance, of size, of velocity, and so on. A lot of the reports that we have in our files are poorly collected data. And so, bad data in, bad data out. So we are striving, but we are trying to change that. We are changing our investigative process to do a more thorough job of quality collection.
No, 10 minutes more.
Is there a big objective there? I mean, okay, we will collect measurements.
Wait, stay here.
Still, where it leads to? What's
Well,
behind it?
I'd like to comment on that. Basically, you're asking a very important question because you're asking what are our real goals. And my opinion, the real goals that have scientific merit are the ones I had in an earlier chart. That is, where are they from and why are they here? How do they work? Where do they come from? And what's their energy source, if there is some? Why are they abducting people? These are, I think, the interesting scientific questions. And the answers to those questions, some of them perhaps may help our society. Some of them may just help our knowledge and history.
So we are hoping to answer these questions by collecting more data and more quality data?
Well, I thought the question you asked is what is our objective? And nobody said that the satisfaction of that objective would be achieved by collecting more data. Yes. Let me just comment that we'll probably wrap up in about 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. Let me see a showing of hands. How many would like to go on for another 10, 15 minutes? Okay. How many want to quit now? Okay. We'll go on for another 10 or 15 minutes. Yes.
I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the time of the swamp gas, supposedly UFO landing that Hynek reported on as swamp gas. I subsequently, because I was interested in the phenomena, went to a UFO conference where Hynek said that he had been specifically ordered by the Air Force to call it something, anything else, make an explanation for it. And he called it swamp gas, which he then disavowed at that conference. So I guess I addressed that to those of you who would say that there is no deception going on.
Yes, go ahead.
Of the people on the panel here, I was the one who knew Alan Hynek the best, so I'm going to take that question. I think that Alan returned to that episode often, and he considered it a really bad mistake, and he would so obsessed with it that although nobody else would bring it up in conversation, he would bring it up in conversation. And I think the question of deception, as I understand what you said, nobody's saying there's no deception. Of course there's deception. The question is, what does the deception mean? The deception is in lousy explanations for puzzling UFO reports that Project Blue Book trafficked in for decades. That doesn't mean that Project Blue Book was covering up evidence for spaceships. It more likely means that Project Blue Book just wanted to get rid of the UFO problem. In fact, that's what the evidence is, that it was a public relations disaster for the Air Force, and every time it thought that UFOs are winding down, the Air Force didn't have to deal with UFOs anymore, UFOs land in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Exactly.
And they really wanted Hynek to drop that potato. And Alan, to the end of his days, regretted that he had cooperated with them on that.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up, because I totally agree with what Jerry said. And if you remember, the Condon report got the right answer. The Air Force just wanted it to go away. And so when they said, not a threat, very little chance of progress, remember, one of the things that goes with this also is resourcing. So that if you've got this as a mission, you've got to handle it, somebody's got to pay the bills. They just wanted it to go away, and it did.
Thank you. Lack of funding is probably a legitimate claim for lack of progress in a lot of psi areas, anomalous areas. However, one person who most generously funded UFO research was, of course, Robert Bigelow. He formed the National Institute of Discovery Science, which went on for some number of years, and in fact investigated one particular phenomena very thoroughly, which was the black triangles. They made a conclusion that those seemed to be our own military that made those. And later, as I recall, they sort of withdrew from that after they researched it a bit further. But I don't think anything came out of all the money that Robert Bigelow put into that UFO research. Any comments about why that might be?
I guess since I worked with NIDS, and in fact I talked to Bob on Sunday, it's one of the things we've been talking about here. Just you have a multiplicity of phenomena, and we went into a wide range of things from personal observations. I mentioned earlier the ranch in Utah that had all kinds of phenomena going on, including UFO phenomena. Did fund some research. Now, what happened, the reason NIDS closed down, by the way, is that he went into, took $500 million of his own money, went into Bigelow Aerospace. And if you're not familiar with it, you actually have 2 of his personal satellites that are circling the Earth right now. And in 10, they're going to send up a habitable one.
Okay.
You're below my hearing threshold.
Okay. Actually, we did have just a quick recess, you might say. And my wife, Linda, has been taking your money and giving you badges all these days. And she has a few announcements.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will stay open for about 15 minutes to sell books if you want to take books up to your room before you retire. When you leave your space, would you please be sure that you have all of your belongings? I brought one up here just as a demonstration. Number 3, we now have a list of attendees at the registration desk. You can pick one of those up, and I'd wish you sweet dreams.
Thank you. Okay, back to questions. Yes, here's one from somebody who hasn't spoken yet. You can pass that down.
For any of you who can answer this, who think that there might be real ETs, if there are nice ETs out there, why don't they talk to us directly, and so that we can get rid of this whole secret government stuff?
Okay. Well, you want me to start? Okay, I'll begin on that one. My opinion is that actually the Star Trek scenario is more accurate than you'd imagine. That is, don't interfere with developing civilizations is a reasonable kind of assumption to make. The other aspect of it, in my opinion, is that there is some evidence, not always very powerful, that there have been interactions with some parts of our government. So in effect, they have had those conversations. And also you'd have to note that whenever they come down and abduct somebody or have a conversation with somebody, they're interacting with the human race. So it's just a question of how you define that interaction. If you're looking for it in the form of a presidential conversation, the answer is apparently not often. Okay, we have one in the back here.
Thank you. I'm not a scientist, but I grew up with science fiction, and it never occurred to me that all the wondrous things that I read weren't possible and didn't exist. My question is, why us? If there are so many worlds and so many civilizations, what makes us so fascinating?
Well, this is really a speculative question. Any one of you want to do that?
I just wanted to comment that if we look at the history of UFOs and all the different reports of these so-called beings coming down and being interested in us, it seems to be overly excessive interest. We just got a report, for example, not too long ago of entities being seen down in North Carolina picking up beer bottles off the ground. So the question is, you know, they've been picking up beer bottles for 60 years. Why are they still doing it? To me, there seems to be more of a display, more of a show, rather than an overt interest. So I would have to say that there's more to the phenomenon than just interest in us.
I remember one particular incident in 1954 in France. This guy was out in the field, and this craft sat down, and the guy got out, and he had a sort of a leather jacket on, and he went up to the Frenchman, and he said, "Quelle heure est-il?" which means, "What time is it?" And the guy looked at his watch, told him, he got back in the craft and took off. That was it.
I think it's pretty well understood that they visit each other, too, that we're not exclusive. So they visit each other and exchange information and culture and so on. And now, I guess, I don't know if we're the new Jamaica or the hot place to go for holidays or whatever it is. I'm a little out of date in these things.
Well, not only are we not exclusive, there's no indication that their communication is exclusively with us.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be going on everywhere.
Right. Another question here?
I grew up on a cattle ranch, and the rancher really doesn't interact with the cows on the cows level. And I don't understand why we automatically assume these are extraterrestrials. The rancher lives on this planet with his cattle. And there's an awful lot of ocean on this planet. There's ice caps. So why do we automatically assume they're extraterrestrials?
Well, actually, I don't assume that. I just don't know where they come from, and I don't know how they get here. But yeah, could be.
The short answer is we don't. I do not assume that it's necessarily ET. That was one of the bullets on my slide. That's ergofusion. If UFOs, therefore ET, not necessarily.
Anybody else?
Dale.
Okay.
I would put the idea that there are terrestrial origin in a very low level of probability. If that were the case, we would have massive evidence of their presence, archaeological evidence, other kinds of physical evidence, evidence of their technology, evidence of their cities and social order. It's just incredibly tall order to believe that a civilization like that could live concealed in our midst. It's really, to me, those kinds of speculations have been revived recently, and I sort of put it in the category of Atlantis and Lemuria, those kinds of lost continent, lore and traditions, and just historically not true.
Jerry, although I completely agree with you on that point, it still doesn't completely explain the undersea objects that are also reported, which might be going to some other location.
Well, we don't have to conclude they live there.
Right.
I mean, they're just,
right.
Passing through the ocean.
True. Right. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I sort of agree with John Alexander's point of view on government involvement, except that I distinctly remember in the mid-'70s and through the early '80s when I was perusing the UFO clipping service that was mentioned, and there were repeated numbers of cases written up in local papers in this country, where the witnesses reported military jets coming over right after the UFO was seen, and that was on numerous occasions. And it appeared to me at the time that it was evidence that there was some kind of covert military UFO investigation going on, where they had a team that would go out and try to intercept them, and presumably there were also ground forces and ground teams that would go out and look for ground traces. But anyway, the reports talked about military jets all the time. It looked to me like that was evidence of a military project. So that may be the tip of an iceberg. I don't know.
Bob, let me address that. By the way, Dale's been trying to get in forever. One of the things we did when we were looking at this, there were certain messages that were in the traffic. We started looking for the pattern. Who gets information? How does information flow? There's messages that come in. You look at all of the addressees, that sort of thing. In order to do the kind of thing you're suggesting means a very broad knowledge. I mean, every base would have to have, contingency plans. This would be out in the open. You just find no evidence for that whatsoever.
If you don't think the government can cover things up, just look back at the history of the development of the nuclear weapon to know that the Manhattan Project was able to conceal a lot of things from a lot of people. They built an entire city in Tennessee under the nose of the very governor of the state. So when people say there's no cover-up, there's no plausibility of cover-up, I just say that's bull.
Coming from Los Alamos, I've got to disagree. That was pretty well known. Soviets broke that one real fast, and the information did become known. As this is one of the things we did bring up with Teller in private conversation. As you said, when that went off, there were 1,000 people who knew, the rest of the world didn't.
When it became
that was
known,
for a very short period of time.
It became known to the Soviets, but not necessarily to the public, right?
Well, but that was, like I said, that was for a very short period of time.
Yeah. Have we another question?
And it did leak.
Yes, I remember back to the when the astronauts returned from the moon. They were quarantined for about a month because of the fear there might be a microbe they would bring back, like the Andromeda strain. So I'm wondering, with the apparent, the alleged stories about ET or extraterrestrials walking around on Earth or visiting us and interacting with people, wouldn't there be a concern about viruses on their part? Their immune system certainly is not adaptable to the Earth habitat.
Yeah, I'd say that's an excellent point. But you brought up something that I use in arguments. I know a number of the lunar astronauts, and I have asked them point blank. Now, you understand Apollo was about a lot more than going to the moon. I mean, we had 4% of our GDP involved in developing that. That was about putting the nation ahead. That was a huge, huge effort. So I asked them, did anybody ever tell you, by the way, if you get up there and you bump into somebody, here's what you say? And you would think that if we had any inkling whatsoever that you might encounter somebody, you would have contingency plans. I do know the lawyers from NASA and from that era. The contingency plans, by the way, was if we ever have an encounter, we will make public knowledge immediately.
Okay, we have a question from a new person here.
I was wondering how the factor of UFO and ET involvement in the mythology of ancient cultures affects the consciousness around all of this.
Jerome, you want to comment on that one?
Well, the idea that extraterrestrials were responsible for creating, pyramids and had a presence in ancient history, really, I think, was invented by Charles Fort, and the theme was picked up in some of the early fringe saucer literature, like George Hunt Williamson, Brinsley Lepore Trench, Desmond Leslie, people like this. I know a lot about this subject because in one of the volumes of my UFO encyclopedia, I have a long entry on the evolution of the folklore about ancient astronauts. It was Eric von Daniken, of course, who was not a ufologist, who really popularized the concept by essentially stealing a lot of ideas from fringe saucer books from the 50s. I place no credibility in this. It's just, as you say, a modern mythology, and it really isn't central to the concerns of the more sober ufologists.
Ernie.
This is directed to John. There was a report in Jane's Defense Weekly about 10 years ago on special access programs, and even a United States Senate report that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan chaired, again in the mid-90s, on special access programs. And at that time, it was claimed there were about 150 special access programs, and the deepest black ones are called unacknowledged waived special access programs, meaning that they don't have to report to the Appropriations Committee or the Authorization Committees. And I'm just wondering what you think about that place for some program having to do with UFOs to reside, because I don't think you can deny that such programs exist since it's been documented even in the U.S. Senate report.
Well, there are certainly, there's a whole black world that is grossly misunderstood. But when you're in the black world, you compete in the black world. And you have one-to-end priority lists, and you've got people inside the sub. It's true that it doesn't get the same level of scrutiny that you would for open source programs, but there is scrutiny, and you have competition between project managers. You're familiar with project management within organizations and what it has to do, and they get to see each other and they get in and fight fiercely for it. So the amount of money that would be necessary to have huge black programs, I don't see that. That would be. That would not, that would fall outside the spectrum. Low level, easy to do. When you get in tens of K, hundreds of K, even millions, you can probably slop that through.
Right.
You start getting into bigger, everybody in the world, and particularly now, and for the last, probably the last decade, with the declining R&D budget, you look at the P6 account, it's been coming down steadily, and since 2001, has been used primarily as a bill payer to pay for the war.
Yeah.
I'm just asking the simple question, do you deny that there are waived and acknowledged special access programs? Because they're referenced in Senator Moynihan's report. And that they may not be having anything to do with UFOs. I mean, they certainly can be involved in weapon systems and things like that, but that level of secrecy does exist.
There are levels of secrecy. In my view, there are none that don't have oversight at some level. These things come together, and if you look at this I think is one of the biggest misunderstandings, is how the budget process works inside the government and inside DOD. And we can sit down and go through this because I've fought many of these battles. There's none of it at any significant levels. Understand we're talking Pentagon levels of significant now.
Well,
It's more than our lunch money, but
I would respectfully point out that John and I disagree on this one point. That is, I'm totally satisfied that the question documents that I have show that special access programs like that do exist and have been very effective. And they've been kept sufficiently secret so that the people who have the kind of approval that you claim would be present just don't know about them, and they're taken offline. So that would be my position.
by the way, unfortunately, the reason a lot of them are kept as black as they are is because they couldn't stand the light of day. They're just not technically very good.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Let's see. Actually, I'd like to make a comment myself in connection with Jerry Clark's comment this morning, because it turns out, as you remember, he talked about ferries, and then he talked about a number of fascinating reports in 1897 that had a great deal of correlation. And what he didn't know is that one of the documents that I have is signed by George Marshall. It's classified secret, as I recall, in 1942, and says we should start a project to study aerial phenomena that are unidentified going back to 1897, and that's in the memo, at the last thing in the memo. So I'll send you a copy of that. I think you need to have that in your archives. Okay, more questions? Actually, I think we're coming to the point, probably in the next 5 minutes we'll wrap this up, so we'll have 2 or 3 more questions.
Must be.
That's good. Good.
I must be learning more because I have more and more questions. I think I've gone from a skeptic to a believer to a debunker all in one day. So my question is, with all these crashes, how is it possible that there's not a piece of spacecraft? They're not all, even if the government has this incredible secrecy thing going on, it's not only this country. Where are all of these? So that's one question. The second question is it a time travel thing? Are they located not in another planet, but in another dimension, such that, okay, we heard about the time-space continuum sort of thing. When they arrive, maybe they miscalculated, and that's why they crashed. What is the possibility that they are actually in another plane of existence, not another planet of existence?
So that's 2 questions, right? Okay. Okay. You want to take those on?
Well, I can't take all of them on, but I'll address one of them. I guess it was last week there was a UFO that crashed over Vietnam, and fragments were recovered. And the question is, how do we get a hold of those? So, those are the things we're looking at. So I don't think it's just this country. Now, we don't know if that's a real UFO or some remotely piloted drone or some military craft of our own origin, but I would say that they do happen in other countries.
Things fall
I think
down.
the United States also does a pretty good job of picking up crashes in Canada and Mexico and anywhere that's nearly close at all. We had one in Manitoba, and by the time our investigators got out there, the United States Army was there. Chief investigator started up, and one of your guys pointed a gun at him and said, "Don't you come too close, boy." And so they go through the processes, and finally somebody in Ottawa said, "Well, let them have it." And the same kind of thing has happened in Mexico. So quite a few of these crashes have wound up wherever they wind up. And I don't know where that is exactly.
My son's book, of course, Magic Eyes Only, identifies 75 different crashes at various levels of confidence.
But things do fall down. I'll give you a specific example. There's one in New Mexico that's quoted as a UFO crash that was half blue, which was the predecessor to the F-117. And if people wanted to say it was a UFO, everybody was really happy to say, it was a UFO. So right now there's a lot of stuff flying around, including space things, and they tend to fall down sometimes. What bothers me with the multiplicity, supposedly, of crashes is we got these highly advanced technologies that can come a gazillion miles and then they bump into each other. That's just something that doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, I've been talking to one more question.
This is on the MJ documents. There is an MJ document that that Einstein and Oppenheimer put out in 1947. It's on the website, on your website. Einstein and Oppenheimer supposedly wrote a letter to Truman, and it is on the website in 1947 in June, before the Roswell crash.
Correct.
Using the word extraterrestrial biological entity, which really confuses me as a researcher because I thought that came out of the Roswell crash. And both of them were very concerned because they called these visitors celestial cultures. And they said, we need to develop something on this earth to deal with this, because after the atomic bomb testing, we're getting all these visitations. And what if, who do they speak to? Who represents this planet? Should we develop a supra-United Nations? It's on that document. Do you think that document's real?
Well, that's an excellent question. The document, the 6-page document that is not signed. However, we have initiated, my son and I have initiated some linguistic authentication, forensic linguistics, with 2 different people to show that the selection of words is totally consistent with the words that Einstein used in that particular era. And I believe that in the next year we'll be able to have a publication on that very subject. In fact,
can we agree to disagree?
Pardon me?
I would push the probability of reality approaching 0.
Okay.
And that's from talking to I've got friends who were there in that era, and
right.
Do not hear anything like that going on.
Okay. Well, we'll wait for the
we'll
report.
Agree to disagree.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is to adjourn this meeting and say, welcome, come tomorrow night and listen to Unconscious.